There was a photograph on the evidence table, 8 inches by 10. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, sitting in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and a paper crown on her head. Someone had made her that crown out of a piece of yellow construction paper. A nurse, I was told. Someone who worked the night shift on the 3rd floor of Mercy General Medical Center in Columbus, Ohio. That photograph is why I'm talking to you today. I have been a judge for 22 years. I have presided over more cases than I can count from memory. Civil, criminal, cases that made the news and cases that no one ever heard about. And I have learned not to carry the evidence home with me. You have to learn that, or this job will hollow you out. But that photograph followed me home. It sat in my mind for months before I felt ready to say any of this out loud. This is that case. If you want to hear the rest of this, and I think you should, subscribe and turn on notifications. I am not saying that for the numbers. I am saying it because this story deserves more ears than it has gotten. Hit subscribe, then let me continue. The plaintiff's name was Renata Okafor. She was 37 years old when I first saw her walk into my courtroom. She was a pediatric nurse, had been for 11 years, all of them at Mercy General. She walked in with a folder tucked under her left arm, and she sat down at the plaintiff's table, and she put the folder in front of her, and she did not open it. She just waited. That was the first thing I noticed about her. She did not fidget. She did not look around. She had already decided something before she came through that door, and whatever it was, it held her steady. She had filed the suit on behalf of herself, 2 other nurses, and the families of 7 children who had been patients in the pediatric ward during the period in question. She was not a lawyer. She had hired lawyers, but she was the one who built the case. The lawyers told me that themselves, in the way that lawyers sometimes acknowledge things they did not expect to be true. I noticed that she wore a pin on her jacket. Small, blue enamel, a child's handprint. I do not know if anyone else in that room noticed it. I did. From the bench, you see everything on a person. The defendant's name was Marcus Hale. He was 54 years old. He was the chief financial officer of Mercy General Medical Center, a position he had held for 9 years. He came into my courtroom the first morning in a suit that was well made and recently pressed. He walked to his chair with the particular kind of ease that comes from spending your whole adult life in rooms where everyone already knows who you are. He sat down. He glanced at Renata Okafor once briefly, and then he did not look at her again for the rest of that morning. He had a legal pad in front of him. He never wrote on it, not once in the entire first day. He would pick up the pen occasionally and hold it, but he never wrote anything down. I have thought about that more than once since. I do not know what it means. I just know that I noticed it. What happened at Mercy General Medical Center began on September 12th, 2 years before this case came to my courtroom. That was the date of an internal budget meeting on the 4th floor of the administrative building. The pediatric ward occupied the entire 3rd floor of the East Wing. 31 beds, a dedicated nursing staff of 18 full-time and 7 part-time, a small playroom that the nurses had stocked over the years, mostly out of their own pockets. Books, toys, a television, a portable projector for movie nights on Fridays. The ward had been running a budget deficit for 3 consecutive years, not a large one. The testimony placed the number at approximately $380,000 annually. In the context of a hospital with a total operating budget of over $200 million, that number was not a crisis. But Marcus Hale had decided to treat it as one. According to emails that were entered into evidence, Hale had been in communication for 8 months prior to that September meeting with a private design firm about what he called a senior leadership wellness environment. In simpler words, an executive lounge, private dining, a private rest suite, a meditation room, a conference area with what the design proposal described as premium finishings befitting the professional class of the institution's leadership. The projected cost of that renovation was $1.4 million. He said in a memo to the hospital's board dated September 14th, 2 days after the meeting, "The pediatric unit's ongoing deficit represents an inefficient use of limited resources in a non-revenue optimized service area." I wrote that down. I read it again the night before I issued my ruling. Before I go further, I need you to subscribe, not as a formality, because there is one piece of evidence in this case, something small, something easy to overlook, that changed the entire direction of my ruling. I want to make sure you are here when I get to it. Subscribe now. The legal process that brought this case to my bench was not a simple path. It began as an internal complaint filed by Renata Okafor and two colleagues in November, 2 months after the pediatric ward was officially restructured, the hospital's word, not mine. The internal complaint was reviewed and dismissed by the hospital's own ethics board in January. The ethics board, I would later learn, included 2 individuals who reported directly to Marcus Hale. From there, the case moved to the State Medical Licensing Board, which conducted a review over approximately 5 months. The licensing board found procedural irregularities but stopped short of formal sanction. Renata Okafor then filed a civil suit in March of the following year, and that suit was assigned to me. There is something that most people who have never sat on this side of a bench do not know about civil cases of this kind. When a private institution closes or reduces a service unit, the legal threshold for establishing harm is considerably higher than people assume. You cannot simply show that a service was removed. You have to demonstrate that the removal fell below the standard of care, that the decision was made in bad faith or with reckless disregard, and that specific documented harm resulted. Each of those 3 things has to be proven separately and completely. That bar existed for a reason. I respected it. And the evidence cleared it. Every part of it. The pediatric ward was not simply downsized. Between September and the following February, it was reduced from 31 beds to 9. 3 of the 7 specialized nursing positions were eliminated. The playroom was converted into a storage room within 2 weeks of the restructuring announcement. 1 pediatric intensivist, the only one the ward had, resigned rather than operate under the new staffing model. She was not replaced. In that same 5-month window, 3 children who were patients at Mercy General experienced delayed care that the medical experts testifying before me directly attributed to the ward's reduced capacity. One of those children was a 6-year-old named Darius Pemberton. He had been admitted for a respiratory complication from asthma. Under the old ward configuration, his escalating symptoms would have been caught on the overnight by a dedicated pediatric nurse. Under the new configuration, the floor was staffed by a rotating general nurse covering a wider section of the building. By the time someone reached Darius, he had been in distress for approximately 40 minutes. He was stabilized. He was discharged 8 days later. But his mother testified that in those 8 days, the doctor used the phrase prolonged episode 3 times. She remembered the phrase because she wrote it down each time she heard it. I want to stop here for a moment, because what I am about to tell you is the part of this case that I had to sit with the longest before I felt ready to speak about it in public. Subscribe before we go further, then take a breath, because this next part matters. The second wave of evidence came from the financial documents, not the public-facing budget reports, which showed the pediatric restructuring as a line item under general operational efficiency, the internal documents, the ones that Renata Okafor had obtained through her counsel via a document production order that took 4 months to enforce because the hospital resisted it at 3 separate stages. Those documents showed the actual cost of the executive renovation, not the projected $1.4 million figure, the final cost, $2.1 million. The overrun was explained in a single email from the design firm to Marcus Hale, in which they noted the addition of bespoke elements per your specifications. Those elements included a custom wine storage unit, a private shower room with imported tile, and a set of 6 hand-stitched leather chairs that the invoice listed at $4,700 each. The third wave was the one that changed the room. Renata Okafor's attorney introduced a budget projection document that Marcus Hale himself had commissioned in the spring before the restructuring. The document was an internal analysis of which departments could absorb cuts to fund the executive renovation. The pediatric ward was not the only option considered. It was the one chosen. And next to the pediatric ward's name on that document, in handwriting that the handwriting analyst confirmed as consistent with Marcus Hale's, someone had written a single word: manageable. That was next to a row that described the department's patient population as primarily under age 12. I watched Renata Okafor when that document was displayed on the screen. She did not look at Marcus Hale. She looked at her hands. One of them was flat on the table. The other one was folded on top of it. I do not know what she was feeling, but I know she had probably seen that word before in the discovery documents and was seeing it again and making herself hold still. I have been doing this for 22 years. I have seen a lot of cases. The ones I choose to talk about publicly are the ones I believe need more people to know about them. Subscribe and tell me in the comments what is hitting you hardest so far. I read what people write. It matters to me. The defense made 4 arguments. I gave each of them serious consideration because that is the job. The first argument was that the restructuring was a legitimate business decision made within the hospital's legal authority as a private institution. That was true as far as it went. Private hospitals do have wide latitude in how they allocate resources. The second argument was that the ward had been reduced, not eliminated, and that the 9 remaining beds represented continued service to the pediatric population. Also true, but the standard of care analysis did not concern itself with whether a service existed. It concerned itself with whether the reduced service was adequate. The expert testimony was clear. The third argument was that Marcus Hale had relied on the recommendations of an outside consulting firm and could not personally be held liable for the harm that resulted from a systemic institutional decision. His attorneys presented 14 pages of documentation showing his reliance on that consulting firm. What they could not explain was why the handwritten word appeared on a document that predated the consulting firm's involvement by 6 weeks. The fourth argument was the one Marcus Hale delivered himself from the stand. He testified for most of a day. His attorneys had prepared him carefully. He was measured. He acknowledged that the outcome had been difficult for families. He said that no financial decision in a hospital setting is made without some human cost, and that he had taken that seriously. And then his attorney asked him to describe his decision-making process when he identified the pediatric ward as the target for reductions. And he paused, and then he said, "Children's services are the heart of what we do, but the heart of what we do has to be supported by a sustainable infrastructure. Without that infrastructure, there is no hospital at all." He said that. I wrote it down. I want to tell you something before I get to the verdict. I grew up in a house where my younger brother had cystic fibrosis. He spent a total of 3 years of his childhood across multiple hospitalizations, not all at once, but in stretches, spread across a decade. I was 14 the first time I sat in a hospital waiting room and watched a night shift nurse come out to talk to my parents. She had been on shift for 11 hours. She sat down with them like she had nowhere else to be. She stayed for 40 minutes. She knew my brother's name, and she used it every time she spoke about him. I have never forgotten that nurse. I do not know her name now. I knew it then, and I have lost it. That is one of the things I am still sorry about. I am not saying my brother's history made me decide this case differently. The evidence decided this case. But I am saying that when Renata Okafor walked into my courtroom with that folder and that pin and that stillness, I recognized something, not from the law, from that waiting room. The day I read my verdict, the courtroom was quieter than usual. I have learned that silence has textures. The silence before a verdict in a case where the outcome is uncertain sounds different from the silence in a case where everyone in the room already half knows what is coming. This silence was the second kind. Marcus Hale sat very still. He had been less composed in the final days of testimony, a slight tightening around the jaw, a way of looking down at the legal pad when certain documents were on screen. Now he was still again, the way he had been on the first day, like he was managing something. Renata Okafor had her hands in her lap. She was looking at me, not anxiously, just steadily. I had made my decision. I had made it days earlier, if I am honest. But the moment still lands differently when it is spoken out loud. The verdict was found for the plaintiff on all 3 counts. Liability was established against Marcus Hale individually and against Mercy General Medical Center as an institution. The first person to make a sound was not at either counsel table. It was a woman in the 3rd row of the gallery. I do not know her name. She pressed both hands over her mouth and she closed her eyes, and she held that pose for several seconds. She was seated next to a man who put his arm around her without looking at her. I believe, though I cannot be certain, that they were Darius Pemberton's parents. The verdict was not the hardest part of this case for me. The sentencing was, because sentencing is where I had to decide not just what was legal, but what was right. Subscribe so you do not miss what I decided. I am getting to it now. I am ordering you, Marcus Hale, to pay $4.2 million in compensatory and punitive damages to be distributed among the 7 families identified in the plaintiff's complaint, with allocation weighted toward the 3 families of children who experienced documented medical harm. I arrived at that number carefully. I considered the hospital's financial capacity, I considered the actual cost of the harm, and I considered the cost of the executive renovation that was the direct alternative to the ward's full operation. The number reflects all 3. I am also ordering the suspension of your eligibility to serve in any executive financial role in any licensed medical institution in this state for a period of 7 years. During that 7 years, you may not sit on a hospital board, you may not serve as a consultant to a hospital finance division, and you may not hold any administrative title at any healthcare facility. That restriction exists because the harm in this case was not a mistake, it was a choice. And choices have consequences for the authority that enables them. I'm ordering 240 hours of community service to be served specifically in public pediatric care settings, children's clinics, pediatric wards at public hospitals, or licensed children's health nonprofit organizations. You will not supervise, you will observe, and you will assist. You will do it in person. You will do it on their schedule, not yours. And there is one more thing. Within 90 days of this ruling, you will draft a written public statement, no fewer than 1,000 words, to be published in the Ohio Hospital Association's quarterly journal and posted for a minimum of 2 years on the official website of Mercy General Medical Center. That statement will describe in specific and non-euphemistic terms the decision you made, the ward you reduced, and the children who were affected. Your legal team may review it for accuracy. They may not soften it. Finally, I am ordering Mercy General Medical Center to fund the full restoration of the pediatric ward to its pre-restructuring capacity, 31 beds, full nursing staff, and a dedicated pediatric intensivist position, and to maintain that capacity for no fewer than 5 years, audited annually by the state licensing board. The cost of that restoration is to be borne entirely by the institution's administrative budget, not its clinical budget, not its nursing payroll, its administrative budget. There is something I said to Marcus Hale directly before I closed the session. I want to say it again now because I think it belongs here. I told him this. What you removed from that floor was not a budget line. It was a place where sick children went when they had nowhere else to go. The nurses who worked there knew every child's name. They made paper crowns on night shifts. They stayed past the end of their shifts because leaving felt wrong. You replaced their workspace with a room full of leather chairs that the people sitting in them did not need. I am not asking you to feel that fully right now. I am telling you what the record shows it cost. To your family who was present in this courtroom, I am not addressing them as if they are responsible for what you did. They are not. But they watched this happen too, and they will carry it alongside you, and I want them to know I saw them here. Privilege in any institution carries an obligation that is not optional. It is structural. When you are given authority over a budget that determines the level of care available to children, you are not managing numbers. You are managing lives. You treated that as a nuance. It is not a nuance. And this is the last thing I will say about it. The children in that ward did not choose to be there. They did not have the option to go somewhere else. You did. Thank you for staying with this. I mean that. I know this is a long story. I know it is not easy. Subscribe if you have not yet. You already know why you are still here. When the session closed, I stayed on the bench for a moment before I stood. I usually stand immediately. That day, I did not. I watched the room. Marcus Hale's attorneys were leaning in toward him, speaking quickly. He was nodding. He did not look devastated. He looked like someone recalculating. Renata Okafor stood up slowly. She picked up her folder. She turned to one of the families in the gallery. I believe it was Darius Pemberton's mother. And she put her arms around her. She did not say anything that I could hear. She just held her there for a moment. Then she stepped back and she straightened her jacket and she picked up her folder again. The room felt, when I finally stood, like something had been exhaled. Not relief, something older than relief, more like the ending of a long-held breath. Marcus Hale's counsel filed an appeal within 30 days. The appeal was heard by the 5th District Court of Appeals, which issued its ruling 14 months later. The appellate court upheld the damages award and the professional suspension in full. It modified the public statement requirement only to extend the publication deadline by 30 days. The core of what I ordered stood. I was not surprised, but I was relieved. That is all I will say about that. On March 4th of the following year, I know the date because Renata Okafor sent a letter to the court, which is unusual, and I kept it. The pediatric ward at Mercy General Medical Center reopened at full capacity. 31 beds, a new intensivist hired. 4 of the original nurses returned. The playroom was restocked. According to the letter, one of the returning nurses brought back the portable projector herself. She had taken it home when the restructuring was announced. She said she did not want it to get thrown away. Marcus Hale, as of the date of that letter, had completed 60 of his required 240 hours at a pediatric clinic on the east side of Columbus. Renata Okafor did not comment on him in the letter. She mentioned the ward. She mentioned the children. She mentioned the nurse who brought back the projector. She did not mention him. The question this case left me with is one I have not answered. I have gotten closer to it, but I have not answered it. The question is this: at what point does an institution stop being what it says it is? Mercy General's mission statement, which was entered into evidence because it appeared on the hospital's internal documents, described the institution as dedicated to the health and dignity of every patient across every stage of life. Marcus Hale had read that statement. He had signed documents that carried it as a header, and then he wrote the word manageable next to a row describing children. I do not think he thought of himself as a person who was doing harm. That is what I keep returning to. I think he thought of himself as a person who was managing a difficult situation responsibly. I have seen that before, not in this specific form, but the mechanism, the ability to process a human cost as a variable rather than a weight. I have seen it, and it does not belong only to this case or this person or this industry. That is the pattern I cannot name cleanly. I have tried. I will keep trying. To the nurses, the parents, the people in waiting rooms at 2 a.m. who have ever been told that the resource they needed was being reallocated, I saw Renata Okafor sit in my courtroom for 4 days and hold herself together in a way that asked nothing of anyone around her. She did not ask for sympathy. She asked for the record to speak. I know that kind of stillness. It is not emptiness. It is the particular composure of someone who has decided that falling apart is not something they can afford. If that is familiar to you, I want you to know that I saw it, and I know what it costs. To anyone who has held a position like Marcus Hale's, not necessarily in a hospital, not necessarily in exactly this form, who has looked at a budget line attached to people who have no power in the room and chosen the path that was convenient, I am not going to condemn you from here. I want to ask you one question instead. It is the question I could not ask from the bench. Do you remember the moment you made the decision, the specific moment? Because in my experience, people who have made choices like this one do remember it. They just do not look at it directly very often. Look at it. That is the only thing I am asking. Then decide what you do next. There are other cases I want to talk about. This is not the only one that stayed with me. Subscribe and you will hear them when I'm ready to tell them. There was a photograph on the evidence table, 8 inches by 10. A little girl, maybe 4 years old, sitting in a hospital bed with tubes in her arm and a paper crown on her head. Someone made her that crown on a night shift. Someone who stayed. Someone who knew that a sick child in a hospital bed at 2 in the morning needs to know that they are still a child, not just a patient. That is why I told you this story. If you want to hear the others, and there are others, subscribe. That is all I'm asking. Subscribe and stay. The comments are where the people who care about the same things find each other. I read them. Write what this brought up for you. I am listening. Renata Okafor.